This experience happened to me while camping in the wilderness of eastern Washington near the Canadian border. Two friends and myself were sitting around the campfire. We were camped on a large flat about midway up the mountain. All of a sudden, we heard a strange screaming noise. The screams were shrill and came in consecutive 1 to 2 second bursts. Here's my attempt to describe the noise onomatopoeically. Raw. 1 second beat, raw. 1 second beat, raw. The noise was getting closer, and I asked my more wilderness-experienced friend if it could possibly be a predator. I know mountain cats can make screaming noises. He said he didn't think so, but we grabbed our rifles anyway. The noise is getting closer, and we can see an animal coming towards us, straight up the fairly steep grade of mountain at a fast pace. I would clock his feet at 25 miles per hour, easily. It was about the speed of someone on a motorbike going at a fast rate. We grabbed our rifles and took aim at this animal as it bolted straight towards our campsite. But what we saw next was not a predator. It was a deer, bounding in huge leaps, screaming entirely on his hind legs. This deer was hopping like a pogo stick with his forelegs held out in front of it. The look of pure terror in his eyes reflected in the firelight will haunt me forever. I've looked for video of deers on their hind legs and such behavior, but I've only ever seen deers getting food out of trees or possibly fighting another deer on their hind legs. My friends joke and say the deer got into some bad mushrooms, but it was truly the strangest experience in my life. Let me preface this by saying that I realize that camping alone in the middle of nowhere isn't the smartest activity a person can engage in. I've lost count of the times that well-meaning busybodies have lectured me about it, but frankly, I just don't care. You see, all of my life, I've done things that I don't particularly want to do. I went to school, I got a job, I paid my bills. Camping, the stillness and the solitude of the forest at night, gives me joy, and joy seems in short supply most days. I never felt afraid in the woods, no matter how remote. I only ever felt calm, peaceful, like I was doing what I was always meant to do. That doesn't mean that I never took precautions. There are 3 things that a solitary woman needs in the woods: a good first aid kit, a good compass, and a good dog. I always went out with all 3, and I always thought that those things could keep me from whatever might be out there in the forest. I was wrong, of course, but just because I only ever considered the living threats. The last camping trip I'll ever take started out normally. I had planned a 3-night loop through a stretch of woods I had never been to before. Due to the unfamiliar and remote terrain, and the fact that I wouldn't be following an established trail, I was only planning on hiking about 8 miles a day before setting up camp each evening. That way I wouldn't ever be too exhausted to make good decisions, and could generally enjoy my new surroundings more thoroughly. I loaded up my pack with all the supplies I'd need, told my parents where I'd be and when I'd return, and headed out to a part of this state that was completely foreign to me. I arrived at the forest early in the day and parked alongside a deserted stretch of gravel road. I could see no sign that the road had been driven down in quite some time, and the thought of having this whole section of woods to myself filled me with a moment of glee. That moment intensified when I opened the passenger side of my car to let Susie out. Susie was the kind of dog that provoked endless speculation about her genetic line, but ultimately she was several different kinds of mutt, all rolled into one. Though not particularly intimidating to look at, Susie was loyal and protective. I wouldn't go on a hike without her by my side, and she was never happier than when she was walking along with me. Susie gave me confidence that I could handle whatever the wilderness threw my way. With my pack loaded high and heavy on my back, Susie and I headed out into the woods. The route I had chosen was rugged and varied, and often I had to stop to check my map and compass. I had opted to walk along the ridgeline the first day, and found that the way was a gauntlet of loose rocks and fallen trees. There was no sign of humanity there. No empty bottles were trailblazers to pull me back into civilization. Despite the hard going, it was paradise. That evening, I set up camp at a clearing near one of the higher ridges. I turned in a bit earlier than I had originally wanted, driven into my tent by the bite of the early fall air. Susie snuggled in next to me as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. Before I knew it, I had been lulled into sleep by the chorus of chirping night insects around me. I woke up in the early morning hours to silence. A glance at my watch showed that it was 1:45 a.m., too early to be anything other than dead asleep. The full moon above illuminated the night, and I spent several seconds watching the shadows of the tree branches dance across the top of my tent. It was downright cold by then, and I zipped my sleeping bag more tightly. I looked at Susie, still laying next to my body. Her eyes were open and focused on something beyond the tent. The wind must have woken her too. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall quickly back to sleep, when I felt Susie growl against me. I murmured a reassurance. "It's probably just a deer, pup." Something, though, didn't feel right. Susie wasn't the type of dog to growl at passing animals. In fact, she lived her life as though other creatures were curiosities at best, and distractions at worst. The only time I'd heard her growl like that was 2 years ago when a black bear came shuffling down a trail and caught us off guard. In a weird way, the thought of a bear outside the tent was a relief. My back was hung from a tree, and bears in this part of the country weren't known to be aggressive. I stroked Susie's fur and waited for the animal to sniff around the campground, determined that we weren't that interesting, and then leave. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of Susie's growling, so low and constant that it could have been a purr. I waited for what seemed like hours, but never heard the animal outside. As the morning went on, Susie's growl was turned into soft whimpers, and I let her crawl into my sleeping bag with me. The sleep that came was fitful and interrupted by strange nightmares, but the morning sunlight eventually made its way into the tent. You may be wondering at this point why I didn't turn around and walk right back out of the woods to my car and back to civilization. Well, the simple reason is that I wasn't worried, so I thought a bear came around the campsite. It wasn't that big of a deal, and besides, I'd be another 8 miles away by the time night came around again. I packed myself up, had a leisurely breakfast, and set out again. The morning's hike was uneventful and beautiful, though Susie stuck disconcertingly close by me, neglecting her usual explorations and mouth ajar with anxiety. Every time I tried to pet her, she stiffened, so I let her be and continued walking on. We stopped in a quiet clearing for late lunch, more than 6 miles into the day's hike. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I noticed it. The silence was total in this clearing. No birds, no chicharras, no rustle of leaves where squirrels leapt from tree to tree. It sent a chill down my spine, and I noticed Susie watching the woods ahead. "Let's get out of here, girl." She looked up at me and whined. When we arrived at the edge of the woods, I immediately saw why there were no bird songs. Their little feathered bodies lay on the forest floor, dotting the fallen leaves with reds, blues, whites, and yellows. I poked a bluebird with my hiking stick, turning it over, looking for signs of predation or illness. I saw nothing strange, other than the mere fact of the lifeless body itself. I expected to need to call Susie to me. Birds were a favorite snack, but she had backed up behind me, another low growl escaping her curled lips. I stepped back to her and clipped a leash to her collar, fearing that she might run, or that I might. The woods remained dead silent. My heart had frozen in my chest, clenched tightly but somehow beating forcefully at the same time. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get out of this forest. I stood where I was and tried to think. I was 14 miles from where I parked my car if I went back the way I came. Given the terrain, I knew I wouldn't make it back before nightfall. I had in my pack a compass and map. I could try to map a new route, one that might take me back faster, but there was no guarantee that I could find my way before dark either. I was at the halfway point of the route, and I had to make the decision: keep going or turn back. I thought back to the campsite the night before. Something was out there. Maybe it was just a bear, but maybe it was something else. The thought of going back to that spot to sleep made me shudder. I knew that I needed to keep going. I'd get as many miles as I could during the rest of the daylight hours, get a few hours of sleep, and then finish tomorrow ahead of schedule. I just had to make it through another night and I'd be back at my car. I steadied myself and forged ahead, Susie tense beside me, hackles raised. The miles melted behind us. There were no stops, no breaks to look at flowers or have a snack, just the constant sound of my boots striking the ground to break the unnatural quiet. Birds littered the ground, and when I came to the next clearing, I had to step carefully through a mass of bodies where a flock of starlings was downed. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trees around me, but saw no movement, only that awful stillness. Slowly the light began to fade, its rays become orange, then diffuse through the leaves. I knew that I had to stop, that I couldn't keep going through the night. The tent, though made of polyester and carbon fiber, would at least allow me the illusion of security. I found a clearing, mostly devoid of dead birds, and set up camp. Susie whimpered. "It's okay, girl. We'll be out of here tomorrow, I promise." I was in my tent before the sun finished its descent behind the trees, hand wrapped tightly around one of my hiking poles, and Susie next to me. Whatever was out there, I just hoped it would leave me alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the strain of the day overcoming me in waves, before the nightmares pulled me back into the world. Susie didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. She just lay there stiffly, every so often emitting another low growl and licking her lips nervously. When I was awake, I listened. The wind moved the branches above me, but nothing else made a sound. I mentally clung to the creaks and groans of the trees, something familiar and reassuring in this strange place. Eventually, though, that too became twisted and bizarre. The branches began to sway above me ferociously, casting shadow fingers across the top of my tent. The wind, however, sounded as if it were dying down. It was as if the branches were moving on their own. But of course, that couldn't be. I sat up in my sleeping bag, fraying my arms and drawing Susie in closer to me. The warmth of her little body and the feel of her breathing gave me comfort in the moments before we both heard it. A crunch of footfall right outside made Susie lunge for the tent door. Frantically, she began clawing at the fabric, whining and snapping her teeth. I tried to hold her still, but she was fighting me at every turn. When the fabric ripped, there was nothing I could do. She bolted into the night. Before I could even process what had just happened, the tent began to shake. The tree branches, once just shadows upon the surface, now grasped and raked against my tent, tearing gashes along its seams. I fought my way out, still clutching the hiking pole, but hopelessly aware of how little good it did. I emerged into the little clearing of my campsite, my ruined tent illuminated by a full moon. The trees were motionless, just as they should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood to attention, though the air was still. The only thing that I could hear was my own ragged breath and the quick percussion of blood through my ears. I backed slowly into the bark of the nearest tree, feeling totally exposed in the clearing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, but the silence continued. Around me, the shadows morphed and writhed as the moon made its way across the sky. My eyes saw things that were not there, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I could think of nothing else to do standing alone and vulnerable in the night, so I started talking, at first to myself, and then to whatever was with me. "Please, I'm sorry," I choked back, giant, ugly sobs. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I didn't know. I'm leaving, I swear. Just one more day and I'll be gone. Please, please, please," became a mantra, a point of focus for my ever-unraveling mind. Instead of looking for forms in the shadows, I instead centered my thoughts around the word, how it felt in my mouth, and how it sounded hoarser and hoarser as the night went on. By the time the gray morning light began to seep through the trees, I was numb. I was numb from fear, from cold, some breeze. I was unsure if I could find the strength in my legs to hike out of this place, but I did. I left my tent where it lay in tatters and started into the woods alone. The rest of the day barely registered with me, if I'm being completely honest. I remember this silence, the feeling of being watched, and please on my cracked lips. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't even have the energy to cry. Sometime later, when I felt well enough to revisit my experience, I looked up at the forest, this corner of nowhere, online. I read stories about the isolation in the wilderness of the forest, about logging crews who had abandoned their machinery, about how the trails had become overgrown and useless. I had seen these stories before my trip, and they excited me. The solitude of it all, the remote, rugged terrain that had driven the less adventurous away. But now I had context. I understood. The forest wasn't for me. It wasn't for any of us. And it made sure that it would always be that way. A group of friends was staying at this remote cabin that one of my friend's cousins owned. There were no roads leading to the cabin, and it was a good 3 or 4 day hike from where you parked the cars. I couldn't go at the same time as everyone else due to work obligations, so I decided to head up the same day, but later. It would mean I would have to camp for a night by myself though. The latter part of the trail is too dangerous to be taken that night, especially for someone who doesn't know it. I didn't care. I was kind of looking forward to it as I've never camped alone before. So I was in the middle of these woods when the sun went down. I got my camp set up in the small clearing, probably 40 feet across. I got my campfire going and pitched a small one-person tent. I did all of that camping stuff like cooking hot dogs on a stick over the fire and made some s'mores. I probably stayed up for a good 2 or 3 hours after dark. The entire time, I thought I heard stuff moving in the woods on the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at first, because the woods are full of animals, but as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing, over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I stooped up, and I thought I heard some sound going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was some fox that probably got curious and then got scared when I stood up. I decided it's time to go to sleep. I douse the fire and climb into my tent. I start to doze off and stay in that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while. I normally hear weird things when I'm in this state, so I don't think much of it when I hear a voice. Something wakes me completely, and I realize the voice is real and right outside my tent. It's just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was another language or if they were speaking English in such a way that I couldn't understand. I lay there for some time. I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There is just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent, so I can see when a hand presses onto the wall of my tent, down near my foot. This freaks me out and I sit up quickly. Whoever was outside of the tent disappeared. I could hear them running full sprint through the woods. I get out of the tent and shine my flashlight around and I see nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but there was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I packed up my camp at first light that morning and booked it to the cabin. This happened when I was a teenager. It still makes me shiver when I think about it. During the early 1990s, I used to camp in the Wicklow Mountains quite often. For those who don't know, Wicklow is a quite large national park on the outskirts of Dublin, Ireland. It is not huge by international standards, but it is big enough to get lost in. Bodies are unearthed there from time to time, often the result of drug deals gone wrong or because of some family dispute. Without specific information, there is no way the police could find a missing person in all those acres of pine forest. In 2017, an army search team found the scattered remains of a person at 8 locations along the isolated 20-kilometer stretch of road running through the mountains. A power tool had been used to dismember the body. Other people have gone missing after they accepted lifts from strangers, never to be seen alive again. Anyway, getting back to the story. During the summer, me and a group of my friends used to head off into the woods. When the weather was very warm, we even made our own tents out of pine branches slung across a frame. We never had any trouble with the locals. That was, of course, apart from the summer of 1992. I was with a group of inner-city lads who were a little tougher than my other friends. As if the location was not scary enough, the place we were set up camp was called Devil's Glen. It is a heavily wooded area with some broadleaf trees, but there were a lot of conifers. It was getting very dark. You also got a lot of deer up there. They can be a bit hazard to traffic, but you don't really meet anybody apart from loggers or the occasional day tripper. It's pretty isolated out here. We had tents with us, but none of us properly equipped for the outdoors. After we set up camp, we decided to visit the local town, really just a couple of shops along our main road. And on our way back to camp, some of the gang stole lighter fluid so we could get a fire going. That night, we drank cider in the woods around a roaring fire, but as night drew in, it began to rain. Lightly at first, but then more heavily. I remember lying on the ground inside my tent because I was a bit drunk. Just then, we could hear what sounded like monks chanting far off into the trees. The forest closed in around us in all directions, and we couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. It sounded exactly like a Gregorian chant, but there was something very unsettling about it. Something evil. We started to get very scared. We were just a group of inner shitty kids, and this was an era before mobile phones. The sound got closer. At one point, it sounded as though it was all around us. I remember my brother, who was with us, panicking. Get him back into the tents, dragging me inside. The lads damped down the fire, and a hush fell over the campsite. After what seemed like ages, we began to hear a sound of muffled footsteps approaching. At first, they were very difficult to make out because of the soft pine needles, and given the noise that we had been making earlier, they probably didn't belong to animals. Eventually, it was very obvious to us all what was going on. In the darkness, we could just about make out the shapes of people silently filing past our campsite before they vanished into the trees. The next morning, we set out to investigate. Our walk led us onto a little used tar road near the camp. Scrawled into the surface were pentagrams and other symbols of devil worship. Needless to add, we got out of there. The following year, some of the group went back, including my brother. They were chased out of the woods by men with dogs, and they ended up having to walk back to Dublin. Just a few years after our camping trip, a shocking story about Devil's Glen made it into the newspapers. A girl had been handcuffed to a tree and assaulted by a group of men. She was only free when her cries were heard by locals. Another middle-aged man was abducted and spent nearly 4 days tied to a tree. When he was eventually found, he was close to death. He spent time in intensive care. Afterwards, the newspapers carry stories with headlines like, "The mountains where no one can hear you scream." To be honest, given the number of people who have gone missing in the Wicklow Mountains, I now think we were all very lucky. What probably saved us that night in 1992 was that we were in a group. I shudder to think what might have happened otherwise. I so have no idea what is going on in Devil's Glen, and I hope I never find out.